Throughout history, empires have fallen, and millions have died not because of grand strategies or inevitable forces, but because someone, somewhere, made a decision so spectacularly stupid that it makes you wonder how our species survived this long. Today we're diving into the moments when human error didn't just change individual lives. It rewrote the entire course of civilization, from diplomatic disasters that triggered continental warfare to scientific breakthroughs that nearly poisoned the planet. And trust me, by the time we're done, you'll realize that chaos theory has nothing on human stupidity. The diplomatic disaster that killed millions. It's the early 1300s, and the world's about to witness what happens when you combine medieval politics with the emotional intelligence of a particularly aggressive hedgehog. Our story begins with Genghis Khan, a man whose name literally means universal ruler, and who had all the diplomatic subtlety of a brick through a window. Now, contrary to popular belief, old Genghis wasn't just running around conquering people for the sheer joy of it. Well, not entirely. At this particular moment, he was actually trying to be civilized, which for a Mongol warlord was like watching a tiger attempt needlepoint. The Mongols had struck up what passed for a peaceful relationship with the Khwarezmian Empire. Think of it as medieval détente, complete with trade agreements and mutual enemies to bond over. Everything was going swimmingly until some bright spark of a governor decided to play highway robbery with a Mongol trade caravan. Now, when we say attacked, we're not talking about demanding a modest tax or confiscating a few goods. This governor went full medieval bandit, stealing everything and murdering every merchant in sight. It was the kind of move that makes you wonder if diplomatic immunity handbooks existed in the 1300s, because if they did, this man clearly used his copy as kindling. Most leaders might have sent a strongly worded letter. Some might have imposed trade sanctions. Genghis Khan, being Genghis Khan, decided to give diplomacy one last shot. He dispatched ambassadors to the Shah of Khwarezm with what was, by Mongol standards, a remarkably reasonable request: punish the rogue governor and let's all move on with our lives. Here's where our story takes a turn from unfortunate international incident to catastrophic error that would echo through the centuries. The Shah, whose decision-making skills apparently rivaled those of a particularly dim-witted pigeon, looked at these Mongol envoys and thought to himself, "You know what this situation needs? More violence." So he killed one of the ambassadors and sent the man's severed head back with the survivors. Let that sink in for a moment. In a world where killing a messenger was considered one of the gravest possible insults, where diplomatic immunity was perhaps the only universally respected concept, the Shah essentially declared war in the most spectacularly offensive way imaginable. It was like responding to a noise complaint by setting your neighbor's house on fire. Now, the Mongols had some very specific cultural beliefs about messengers. Harming an envoy wasn't just rude, it was a cosmic violation, a slap in the face to the very concept of civilized discourse. In Mongol society, you could probably get away with insulting their mothers, questioning their horse-riding abilities, even criticizing their fermented mare's milk. But touch their ambassadors. That was asking for the kind of trouble that archaeologists would still be digging up centuries later. Genghis Khan's response was swift, decisive, and absolutely devastating. He assembled what can only be described as history's most thorough customer complaint department, except instead of demanding to speak to the manager, they were coming to burn down the entire company headquarters and salt the earth where it stood. The Mongol war machine rolled west with the efficiency of a medieval industrial accident. City after city fell, not just conquered, but utterly obliterated. The Khwarezmian Empire, which had been a major player in Central Asian politics, was erased from the map so thoroughly that it makes you wonder if they should have included "Are you absolutely sure?" confirmation dialogue in their diplomatic protocols. But here's the truly staggering part. The destruction didn't stop at the Khwarezmian border. Once you've got several 100,000 extremely motivated Mongol warriors on the move, they don't just pack up and go home after completing their original mission. That would be like expecting a forest fire to politely stop at property lines. The wave of conquest rolled through Persia, devastated parts of the Middle East, and eventually crashed into Eastern Europe like a tsunami of horses and fury. Cities that had stood for centuries became archaeological sites overnight. Trade routes that had connected civilizations for generations turned into graveyards. Conservative estimates put the death toll in the millions. Some historians suggest it might have been higher, much higher. We're talking about casualties that wouldn't be matched until the industrial-scale warfare of the 20th century, all because one man couldn't handle a diplomatic conversation like a grown-up. The truly tragic irony: at the time this all started, Genghis Khan was busy fighting a war in China. His armies were committed, his attention was divided, and he probably would have been perfectly happy to settle the whole caravan incident with an apology and maybe some compensation. The Shah had caught the Mongol Empire at literally the best possible moment to negotiate, when they were least likely to want another major conflict. Instead, through what can only be described as spectacular diplomatic malpractice, he managed to redirect the full fury of the Mongol war machine toward his own empire, and by extension half the known world. But this tale of catastrophic miscommunication was just the beginning, because as we'll see, when it comes to human beings making decisions that accidentally reshape civilization, the early 1300s were just getting warmed up. What happens when you give a German submarine commander access to technology that could change the course of the Second World War, then watch him make a series of decisions that would make a goldfish question his judgment? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into next. 2. The submarine captain's gift to Allied victory. Speaking of decisions that accidentally changed the world, let's sail into the North Atlantic circa 1941, where a German submarine captain was about to hand the Allies the keys to Nazi Germany's most closely guarded secrets. U-110 wasn't your typical submarine. Think of it as a steel coffin packed with some of the most sophisticated military technology of its time, including Germany's crown jewel of wartime communication, the Enigma machine. This little device was supposed to make German naval messages absolutely unbreakable, more secure than the crown jewels and considerably more useful for winning wars. The submarine's first mission in March had been what military historians politely call a bit of a cock-up. After managing to damage 2 Allied ships, the crew had to limp home because some genius had an argument with their own gun, and the gun won. It was the kind of debut that makes you wonder if someone should have spent a bit more time reading the instruction manual. But Fritz Julius Lemp, the submarine's commander, was determined to prove that U-110 could be more than just an expensive accident waiting to happen. So off they went on their second mission, prowling the North Atlantic like a mechanical shark with a particularly elaborate death wish. For a while things went swimmingly, if you'll pardon the expression. They sank several Allied ships and were probably feeling rather pleased with themselves. Submarine warfare, after all, was supposed to be about striking fast and disappearing into the depths like some sort of maritime magician. Unfortunately for Herr Lemp, the British had developed their own magic trick, finding German submarines and introducing them to the business end of a depth charge. On May 9th, 1941, U-110 found itself in the uncomfortable position of being hunted by British warships who were taking this whole war business rather seriously. The submarine was hit by depth charges, which for those unfamiliar with naval warfare, are essentially underwater grenades designed to crush submarines like tin cans. Now, when your submarine is being systematically demolished by explosives, the standard procedure is fairly straightforward. Surface if you can, surrender if you must, and above all else, destroy any classified materials before the enemy gets their hands on them. It's Submarine Warfare 101, the kind of thing they presumably covered on day 1 of U-boat school. But as the damaged submarine was forced to surface, gasping for air like a mechanical whale, something went spectacularly wrong with this simple protocol. The British warships surrounded the crippled U-boat, initially ready for a fight. When they realized the German crew was surrendering, they held their fire and prepared for what should have been a routine prisoner capture. Standard stuff, really. Now take the prisoners, sink the sub, file the paperwork. Here's where our story takes its fateful turn. Fritz Julius Lemp looked around his doomed submarine and made a horrifying discovery. The scuttling charges which were supposed to sink the sub and destroy all its secrets hadn't worked properly. His submarine was floating on the surface like a gift-wrapped present for British intelligence. In a moment of what can only be described as desperate heroism or spectacular poor judgment, Lemp decided to swim back to his submarine and manually destroy the Enigma machine. It was a noble gesture, the kind of thing that gets you mentioned in military histories with words like brave and dedicated. It was also completely pointless. Lemp disappeared somewhere between the British ships and his submarine. Whether he drowned, was shot, or simply vanished into the North Atlantic remains one of those wartime mysteries that historians argue about at conferences. What we do know is that while he was playing underwater hero, British sailors were already boarding his abandoned submarine. And there, sitting in U-110, like the world's most valuable prize in a particularly deadly treasure hunt, was an intact Enigma machine, complete with codebooks, spare rotors, and all the technical documentation needed to crack German naval communications. The British, being British, handled this windfall with characteristic understatement and bureaucratic efficiency. They quietly recovered everything useful, let the submarine sink to maintain the fiction that it had gone down with all hands, and shipped the Enigma materials off to Bletchley Park, where the code breakers were probably doing little dances of joy in their sensible shoes. The intelligence coup was absolutely massive. The captured materials gave British cryptographers unprecedented insight into German naval encryption, particularly something called Reserve Hunerin, a backup cipher that the Germans thought was completely secure. For the rest of the war, British intelligence could read significant portions of German naval communications, like morning newspapers. They knew where U-boats were going, when supply ships would arrive, and what the German Navy was planning before half the German Admiralty did. The strategic implications were staggering. Allied convoys could avoid wolf packs of submarines. Supply runs became surgical strikes rather than desperate gambles. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had been grinding away Allied shipping at an unsustainable rate, began to shift in Britain's favour. And all because Fritz Julius Lemp's submarine had a mechanical malfunction at exactly the wrong moment, followed by his decision to go swimming when he should have stayed put and accepted capture like a sensible person. The truly maddening part, from a German perspective, was how close they came to avoiding this disaster. If the scuttling charges had worked properly, if Lemp had stayed with his crew, if the British had been just a few minutes slower boarding the submarine, the Enigma machine would have gone down with the ship, and the war might have taken a very different course. Instead, what should have been a routine submarine loss became one of the most significant intelligence breakthroughs of the Second World War. The ripple effects lasted years, saved thousands of Allied lives, and helped turn the tide in the Atlantic. But speaking of things that should have been routine turning into history-changing disasters, let's journey to the Byzantine Empire, where an emperor's trusting nature was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who pretends to be your friend. 3. The emperor who trusted too much. The year is 774. The Byzantine Empire is doing what it does best, meddling in other people's business, and Emperor Constantine V has just learned a lesson about trust that would make a therapist weep. Constantine had launched a military campaign against Bulgaria that went about as well as you'd expect from Byzantine military planning, which is to say it failed with all the efficiency of a chocolate teapot. But here's the thing about Byzantine politics. Military failure was just Tuesday. What really mattered was having good intelligence, and Constantine had managed to build himself quite the spy network inside the Bulgarian court at Plusa. For a while this arrangement worked beautifully. Bulgarian plans would be hatched in secret meetings, and within days Constantine would know exactly what his enemies were plotting. It was like having a subscription to your rival's diary, complete with detailed notes about their weekend plans and romantic troubles. The Bulgarian ruler, a man named Telerig who possessed the kind of cunning that makes you wonder if he should have been running a medieval consulting firm, began to notice something disturbing. Every time he made a plan, Constantine seemed to know about it before the ink was dry on the parchment. It was as if the Byzantine emperor had developed psychic powers, or possibly just a very sophisticated postal service. Now, most rulers in Telerig's position might have conducted a general purge, executed a few random courtiers to send a message, and called it a day. Medieval justice wasn't exactly known for its surgical precision, but Telerig had something more valuable than ruthlessness. He had imagination. Instead of playing the usual game of guess which courtier is the traitor, Telerig decided to turn the entire situation on its head. With a plan so elegant it belongs in a textbook on psychological warfare, he composed a message to Constantine that was, by medieval standards, a masterpiece of manipulation. The letter claimed that Telerig wanted to defect to Constantinople, abandon his throne, and join Constantine's court. It was the kind of offer that would make any emperor's day. Imagine your main rival deciding to switch sides and hand you his entire kingdom. But here's where Telerig's plan reached its truly devious peak. He told Constantine that he needed the names of all the Byzantine agents in the Bulgarian court. Why? Well, obviously, he had to make sure they stayed safe during his escape. After all, what kind of defector would abandon the brave spies who had been risking their lives to help the enemy? It was a request that combined apparent loyalty with practical necessity, wrapped up in just enough concern for human life to seem genuinely noble. The kind of message that hits every emotional button simultaneously, while your rational brain is too busy celebrating to ask awkward questions. Constantine, displaying the kind of trusting nature that would make a medieval fairy tale character seem cynical by comparison, looked at this message and thought, what a splendid fellow this Telerig is. Clearly I should give him everything he asks for immediately. So he compiled a complete list of his Bulgarian intelligence network, names, locations, methods of communication, probably their favourite breakfast foods and childhood pets, and sent it off to Telerig, with what we can only imagine was a heartfelt note about looking forward to their future friendship. Telerig received this intelligence windfall, and promptly demonstrated why he had survived the rough-and-tumble world of medieval Bulgarian politics. Instead of packing his bags for Constantinople, he spent what must have been a very satisfying afternoon having every single Byzantine spy in his court executed. In one swift move, he had completely destroyed Constantine's intelligence network, secured his own throne. The beauty of the plan was its psychological sophistication. Telerig hadn't just outmaneuvered his enemy, he had gotten his enemy to destroy his own intelligence apparatus voluntarily. It was like convincing someone to burn down their own house, because you told them it would make a lovely bonfire. Constantine, presumably sitting in Constantinople waiting for news of Telerig's arrival, and wondering why his spies had suddenly gone silent, must have experienced one of history's more uncomfortable moments of realization. That dawning understanding that he had been comprehensively outplayed by someone who understood human nature better than he understood his own strategic interests. The ripple effects of this intelligence disaster extended far beyond the immediate embarrassment. Without his spy network, Constantine lost his strategic advantage over Bulgaria. His ability to anticipate enemy movements, intercept communications, and plan preemptive strikes vanished overnight. It was a perfect example of how medieval politics worked when you combined absolute power with the emotional intelligence of a particularly trusting golden retriever. Constantine had the resources of an empire at his disposal, but he lacked the one thing that might have saved him, a healthy dose of paranoia. The truly maddening aspect of this whole affair is how easily it could have been avoided. A simple verification process, perhaps asking for proof of Telerig's intentions before handing over state secrets, or maybe just waiting to see if the Bulgarian ruler actually showed up at the border before trusting him completely. Instead, Constantine's desire to believe in Telerig's defection overcame any reasonable security protocols, turning what should have been a moment of triumph into a textbook case of how not to run an intelligence operation. But if you think trusting the wrong person is bad, wait until you hear what happens when a single word, spoken at exactly the wrong moment, brings down one of history's most famous walls. For the word that toppled a wall Sometimes history pivots on the grandest gestures, Mech declarations of war, treaties signed with golden pens, armies marching across continents, and sometimes it pivots on a middle-aged bureaucrat shuffling through his papers and saying the wrong word at exactly the right moment. November 9th, 1989, East Berlin. The communist government was doing what communist governments did best in their final years, making a spectacular mess of even the simplest public relations exercises. Enter Günter Schabowski, a man who had recently become the unofficial spokesperson for East Germany's ruling Politburo, which sounds impressive until you realise it was rather like being appointed captain of the Titanic after it had already hit the iceberg. The East German government was crumbling faster than a stale biscuit, and everyone involved was desperately trying to maintain the fiction that they still had some semblance of control over events. The Politburo had just held one of their meetings where they discussed easing travel restrictions to West Germany. This was the kind of delicate policy discussion that required careful planning, precise timing, and above all, keeping your mouth shut until everyone had agreed on exactly how to present it to the public. It was the sort of sensitive political manoeuvring that demanded the diplomatic skills of a seasoned statesman, the timing of a Swiss watchmaker, and the discretion of a professional secret keeper. Instead, they sent Schabowski to handle it. Now, to be fair to Herr Schabowski, he probably thought he was walking into a routine press conference, answer a few questions about agricultural policy, deflect some inquiries about the economy, maybe discuss the weather, standard communist bureaucrat stuff. But then some journalist, displaying the kind of journalistic instinct that makes editors weep with joy, asked when the new travel rules would take effect. This should have been Schabowski's cue to give the sort of carefully crafted non-answer that politicians had been perfecting since the invention of democracy. Something about ongoing consultations, careful implementation processes, or discussions at the highest levels. The kind of beautifully meaningless response that says absolutely nothing while taking 3 paragraphs to say it. Instead, Schabowski did what any of us might do when caught off guard at work. He shuffled through his papers, looking for information that clearly wasn't there, and then said the first thing that came into his head. One word, just one simple, devastating word that would echo through history books for decades to come. Immediately, the moment that word left his lips, something extraordinary began to happen. East Berliners, who had been living behind the Berlin Wall for 28 years, suddenly realised they might be free to cross into West Berlin for the first time since their childhoods. News of Schabowski's announcement spread through East Berlin faster than gossip in a small village. People began moving toward the wall tentatively at first, then in growing numbers, then in crowds that swelled like a human tide. The border guards, poor souls, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of being the last to know about major policy changes affecting their jobs. They had heard Schabowski's press conference just like everyone else, but nobody had bothered to send them updated orders, new procedures, or even a hastily scribbled note explaining what the hell was going on. So there they were, watching thousands of East Berliners approaching their checkpoints, demanding to cross into the West while holding orders that said absolutely nothing about letting anyone through. It was the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that makes you understand why revolutions happen. The guards, faced with an impossible situation and armed with nothing more useful than outdated procedures and growing confusion, made the only reasonable decision available to them. They opened the gates. What followed was one of those moments that reminds you why human beings, despite all evidence to the contrary, East and West Berliners flooded across the border in both directions, embracing relatives they hadn't seen in decades, crying, laughing, and generally behaving like people who had just discovered that the thing they thought was impossible had suddenly become routine. People began climbing on the wall, not to escape anymore, but to celebrate. They brought hammers, pickaxes, and anything else that could chip away at the concrete that had divided their city. By 11:30 that night, the Berlin Wall, that symbol of Cold War division, that monument to human stubbornness and political intractability, was effectively finished. The speed of it all was breathtaking. Hours earlier, crossing from East to West Berlin could get you shot. Now families were having impromptu reunions in the middle of former death strips. The ripple effect spread far beyond Berlin. The fall of the wall became a symbol of the collapsing Soviet system, accelerating changes across Eastern Europe and contributing to the end of the Cold War itself. And it all started because one bureaucrat, caught unprepared at a press conference, said immediately, instead of "we're still working out the details." The mystery that historians still debate is whether Szybalski knew exactly what he was doing. Some argue he simply misunderstood the timing of the policy implementation. Others suggest he knew precisely what that one word would accomplish, and decided to give history a push in the right direction. Either way, his spontaneous answer to an unexpected question transformed what should have been a gradual, carefully managed policy change into a moment of spontaneous liberation that defined the end of an era. But if you think one word can change history, wait until you see what happens when millions of people decide to declare war on birds, because our next story involves one of the most catastrophic misunderstandings of nature, since someone decided that putting lead in gasoline was a brilliant idea. The 5. The war against birds that starved millions. From walls falling to ecosystems collapsing, because when human beings decide to fight nature, nature has a disturbing habit of fighting back with compound interest. China, 1958. Mao Zedong had decided that what his country really needed was a great leap forward, which sounds inspiring until you realize it was the kind of leap that usually ends with someone face first in a ditch, wondering where it all went wrong. The Four Pests campaign was one of the crown jewels of this grand plan, a nationwide effort to rid China of what the government had identified as the 4 greatest threats to human prosperity: rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. Now, 3 of these choices made perfect sense. Rats spread disease and eat grain, flies spread disease and annoy everyone, mosquitoes spread disease and make outdoor life miserable. These are reasonable targets for any public health campaign. The sparrows, however, were included based on what can only be described as the most catastrophic misunderstanding of basic ecology, since someone decided that introducing rabbits to Australia was a brilliant idea. The government's logic was beautifully, tragically simple. Sparrows eat grain. Grain is needed to feed people. Therefore, eliminating sparrows would mean more food for everyone. It was the kind of reasoning that makes perfect sense right up until you think about it for more than 30 seconds. The campaign against sparrows was launched with all the efficiency and enthusiasm that only a totalitarian state can muster. Millions of people across China, men, women, children, probably the occasional confused tourist, were mobilized in what can only be described as the world's largest coordinated bird-bothering exercise. The strategy was as simple as it was relentless: make life impossible for sparrows until they literally died of exhaustion. People were ordered to bang pots and pans, blow whistles, shout, wave flags, and generally create such a racket that sparrows couldn't land anywhere to rest. Imagine the scene: entire cities filled with people making noise like some sort of massive coordinated percussion section, all aimed at preventing small birds from having a moment's peace. It was probably the only time in history when complaining about noise pollution would have gotten you arrested for counter-revolutionary activities. The campaign worked with horrifying efficiency. Sparrows, unable to land and rest, began dropping from the sky from sheer exhaustion. Nests were destroyed, eggs were smashed, and the Eurasian tree sparrow population in China was driven to the brink of extinction. For a brief shining moment, it must have seemed like a triumph of human will over nature. The sparrows were gone, the grain was safe, and surely now China would have more food than anyone knew what to do with. This is the point where basic ecology decided to remind everyone why it's called a science and not a suggestion. Without sparrows to eat them, insect populations exploded. Locusts, caterpillars, and various crop-destroying pests multiplied like someone had declared an insect holiday and forgotten to send the memo to their natural predators. The results were swift and devastating. Insects devoured crops with an efficiency that made the grain-eating sparrows look like casual snackers. Fields that should have fed thousands were stripped bare by swarms of bugs that now had no natural enemies to keep their numbers in check. The ecological disaster combined with other brilliant policies of the Great Leap Forward, like melting down farming tools to make useless steel in backyard furnaces, to create what became known as the Great Chinese Famine. The death toll was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest 20 to 30 million people died, though some historians believe the number was even higher. It was one of the worst famines in human history, and it was almost entirely preventable. The sparrows, it turned out, hadn't just been eating grain, they had also been eating enormous quantities of insects that destroyed crops. The grain they consumed was a small price to pay for the pest control services they provided. It was an ecological balance that had evolved over thousands of years, and it took human interference exactly 1 year to destroy completely. By 1960, even the Chinese government couldn't ignore the obvious connection between the disappearance of sparrows and the explosion of crop-destroying insects. They quietly dropped sparrows from the 4 pests list and began targeting bedbugs instead, presumably because bedbugs don't provide any vital ecological services that bureaucrats might misunderstand. But the damage was done. The famine continued for years, millions more died, and China learned one of history's most expensive lessons about the importance of understanding ecological relationships before deciding to eliminate entire species. The truly maddening aspect of this disaster is how easily it could have been avoided. A basic understanding of food webs, a consultation with actual ecologists, or even just asking some farmers about the relationship between birds and insects might have prevented one of the 20th century's greatest humanitarian catastrophes. Instead, ideology triumphed over science, political enthusiasm overcame ecological understanding, and millions of people paid the price for their leaders' spectacular misunderstanding of how nature actually works. But if you think declaring war on sparrows was humanity's greatest scientific blunder, wait until you meet Thomas Midgley Jr., a man whose inventions were so spectacularly harmful to the planet that they make the 4 Pests campaign look like a minor gardening error. 6. Meet the man who, through nothing more than scientific curiosity and spectacularly bad timing, managed to damage Earth's atmosphere in ways that wouldn't be fully understood until decades after his death. If environmental destruction were an Olympic sport, Midgley would have won gold medals in categories that hadn't been invented yet. The year was 1921, and Midgley was working at General Motors, trying to solve what seemed like a perfectly reasonable problem. Car engines were making knocking sounds. Not the kind of gentle tapping that suggests your engine might need attention, but the sort of aggressive knocking that sounded like angry metal demons were fighting inside your combustion chamber. Engine knock was more than just annoying, it limited engine performance and made cars less efficient. It was the kind of technical problem that kept engineers awake at night, dreaming of solutions that would make them heroes of the automotive industry. Midgley, displaying the kind of innovative thinking that makes scientific breakthroughs possible, discovered that adding a chemical called tetrathiol lead to gasoline could eliminate engine knock completely. TEL, as it came to be known, worked beautifully. Engines ran smoother, cars performed better, and the automotive industry had found its miracle cure. There was just one tiny problem. Tetrathiol lead was spectacularly toxic to human beings. The early factories that produced TEL became case studies in industrial horror. Workers began experiencing hallucinations, mental illness, and in some particularly grim cases, death. The factories were dubbed loony gas buildings, which should have been a fairly significant clue that something was amiss. But this was the 1920s, an era when workplace safety regulations were more like workplace safety suggestions, and the economic benefits of leaded gasoline were simply too attractive to ignore. TEL was heavily promoted and quickly spread around the world, becoming the standard automotive fuel additive for decades. Meanwhile, lead was quietly accumulating in the atmosphere, settling into soil, contaminating water supplies, and generally making its way into every corner of the global ecosystem. Children growing up in cities with heavy traffic were breathing lead-contaminated air during their most crucial developmental years. But Midgley wasn't finished reshaping the planet's atmospheric chemistry. In the late 1920s, he helped develop Freon, the first chlorofluorocarbon, to be used as a refrigerant. CFC seemed like another brilliant solution to a genuine problem. Existing refrigerants were toxic, flammable, or both, making early refrigerators roughly as safe as keeping explosives in your kitchen. Freon was stable, non-toxic, and didn't explode. It worked so well that it was soon being used not just in refrigerators, but in aerosol sprays, air conditioning systems, and various industrial applications. It seemed like the perfect chemical, useful, safe, and profitable. For decades, both of Midgley's inventions were hailed as triumphs of applied chemistry. Leaded gasoline kept engines running smoothly, while CFCs kept food fresh and homes comfortable. The man was practically swimming in patents and professional accolades. The problem, of course, was that neither invention stayed conveniently contained in its intended application. Lead from gasoline exhaust was accumulating in the atmosphere and settling everywhere. By the 1970s, scientists were beginning to understand the full scope of environmental lead contamination. Children in urban areas had elevated blood lead levels, which correlated with developmental problems, learning difficulties, and behavioral issues. The miracle fuel additive was slowly poisoning an entire generation. Meanwhile, CFCs were floating up into the stratosphere, where they were doing something that nobody had anticipated, destroying the ozone layer. The ozone layer, for those who missed that particular environmental science class, is basically Earth's natural sunscreen. It protects us from ultraviolet radiation that would otherwise turn the planet's surface into something resembling a cosmic tanning bed set to crispy. CFCs, it turned out, were incredibly stable. So stable that they could float up into the stratosphere unchanged, where ultraviolet radiation would finally break them apart, releasing chlorine atoms that would then systematically dismantle ozone molecules with the efficiency of molecular vandals. The discovery of the ozone hole over Antarctica in the 1980s was like finding out that someone had been quietly removing bricks from the foundation of your house for decades. Suddenly, scientists realized that Midgley's safe refrigerant was contributing to a global environmental crisis that could increase cancer rates, disrupt food chains, and generally make life on Earth considerably less pleasant. Both discoveries led to worldwide bans. Leaded gasoline was phased out in most countries by the 1990s, while CFCs were banned under the Montreal Protocol of 1987. But the damage was already done. Lead contamination persists in soil and water systems decades later, while the ozone layer is still recovering from CFC damage. One historian famously observed that Midgley had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth's history, which is the kind of legacy that makes you wonder if there should be warning labels on chemistry degrees. The truly tragic irony of Midgley's story is that both of his major inventions seemed like genuine improvements at the time. Engine knock was a real problem, dangerous refrigerants were a legitimate concern, and his solutions worked exactly as advertised. He wasn't a villain, he was a competent chemist solving practical problems with the best information available. The environmental consequences only became apparent decades later, long after his inventions had become entrenched in industrial processes worldwide. It was a perfect example of how technological solutions can create problems that are far worse than the original issues they were designed to solve. But perhaps the most grimly appropriate aspect of Midgley's story is how it ended. In 1944, after being paralyzed by polio, he invented an elaborate system of pulleys and ropes to help caregivers move him in and out of bed. It was another example of his inventive mind creating mechanical solutions to practical problems. One day, he became entangled in his own contraption and was strangled to death by the very device he had created to make his life easier. Whether it was an accident or suicide remains unclear, but there's something darkly fitting about a man whose inventions had such devastating unintended consequences, meeting his end through yet another mechanical mishap. Midgley's legacy serves as a sobering reminder that good intentions, scientific competence, and immediate practical benefits don't necessarily translate into long-term wisdom. Sometimes the most dangerous innovations are the ones that work exactly as intended, right up until you discover what else they're doing that nobody thought to check. But speaking of unintended consequences and things that seemed like good ideas at the time, let's travel to the height of the Cold War, where a simple case of mistaken identity nearly triggered the nuclear apocalypse. 7. The bear that almost ended the world. The 1960s were determined to prove that the human species had developed technology far beyond its collective wisdom. October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world was balanced on the edge of nuclear annihilation like a drunk person trying to walk a tightrope, and everyone involved was desperately trying to pretend they knew what they were doing. The United States and Soviet Union were engaged in what historians politely call a standoff, though elaborate game of chicken with thermonuclear weapons might be more accurate. Both sides had enough nuclear missiles pointed at each other to turn the planet into a very large, very radioactive parking lot. It was around midnight at Duluth Air Base, where American military personnel were maintaining the kind of heightened alert status that makes everyone jumpy, paranoid, and prone to seeing threats in every shadow. A guard on perimeter duty spotted an unknown figure climbing the fence. In the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis, this was approximately equivalent to finding a suspicious package ticking ominously in your living room. American military planners had been very specific about Soviet tactics. If nuclear war began, the first move would likely be sabotage attacks on American military bases to cripple the country's ability to respond. Every guard had been briefed on this scenario. Every soldier knew that base security was literally a matter of life and death for millions of people. So when the guard saw someone climbing the fence in the middle of the night during the tensest moment of the Cold War, he did exactly what his training dictated. He opened fire and triggered the sabotage alarm. This alarm system had been designed with admirable efficiency. When one base detected a potential attack, every nearby installation would be automatically alerted, ensuring rapid, coordinated response to Soviet sabotage attempts. It was the kind of military planning that worked beautifully on paper and in training exercises. Unfortunately, nobody had accounted for what would happen when the system encountered a wiring error. At Volkfield Air Base in Wisconsin, the automatic alarm system had developed what military historians delicately describe as a technical malfunction. Instead of receiving the standard sabotage alert, the base's alarm system activated a klaxon siren that had a very specific meaning. Nuclear war has begun. Fighter jets armed with nuclear weapons should take off immediately. The pilots at Volkfield were operating under DEFCON 3, a state of heightened readiness just short of full-scale war. They had been explicitly told that there would be no practice drills at this alert level. Panny's signal to launch would be the real thing. So when they heard the klaxon, they logically concluded that World War III had started, and they were being ordered to deliver nuclear weapons to Soviet targets. The jets began rolling toward the runway, their pilots presumably running through mental checklists that ended with drop nuclear bomb, try not to think about the millions of people about to die. Meanwhile, back at Duluth, someone had finally gotten close enough to identify the mysterious fence climber that had triggered this entire sequence of events. It was a bear. Just a bear, probably looking for food or investigating interesting smells, completely unaware that it had nearly caused the nuclear extinction of human civilization. By the time this discovery was made, however, the jets at Volkfield were already taxiing toward takeoff. The pilots, believing they were responding to the beginning of nuclear war, were following protocols designed to get nuclear-armed aircraft into the sky as quickly as possible. An officer at Duluth, presumably experiencing the kind of adrenaline rush that comes with realizing you're about to accidentally end the world, jumped into a car and raced to the runway at Volkfield. Picture this scene: fighter jets loaded with nuclear weapons moving toward takeoff, pilots mentally preparing for what they believed was the start of World War III, while one frantically speeding car tried to reach them before they became airborne. The officer reached the runway and managed to signal the pilots to stop just as they were approaching takeoff speed. The jets halted, the nuclear weapons stayed on the ground, and human civilization continued existing. The entire sequence of events, from bear climbing fence to jets, Nearly taking off with nuclear weapons had lasted perhaps minutes. The margin between embarrassing false alarm and nuclear apocalypse had been measured in seconds, and the top speed of a military vehicle driven by a man who really needed to catch some airplanes. The Cuban Missile Crisis was ultimately resolved through diplomacy, back-channel negotiations, and a mutual recognition that nuclear war would be bad for everyone involved. But this incident remained largely classified for years, a reminder of how close the world came to ending not through grand strategic decisions, but through a combination of mechanical failure, animal behavior, and split-second timing. The bear presumably wandered back into the wilderness, completely oblivious to its brief role as potential catalyst for global extinction. This story perfectly captures the absurd terror of the Cold War era. Weapons so powerful they could end civilization, deployed by systems so complex that a single wiring error could trigger global catastrophe, all set off by wildlife that had no idea it was trespassing in a nuclear-armed military installation. It's a reminder that for all our sophisticated planning and technological advancement, the fate of human civilization sometimes depends on whether one person can drive fast enough to stop something that should never have started in the first place. But if you think animals causing diplomatic disasters is a modern phenomenon, wait until we travel back to the 1500s, where an engineer's job application was about to determine the fate of one of history's greatest empires. Ate the engineer who built an empire's doom, Constantinople, 1452. The Byzantine Empire was doing what it had been doing for several centuries, clinging to existence with the determination of a barnacle on a sinking ship. What had once been the eastern half of the Roman Empire was now essentially just Constantinople, and a few surrounding territories, holding on through a combination of diplomatic cunning, strategic marriages, and sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. Enter Orbin, an engineer and iron founder from Hungary, whose timing was about to prove spectacularly unfortunate for the last remnants of the Roman Empire. Orbin had heard that Emperor Constantine XI might be interested in his services, particularly his expertise in artillery and siege warfare. This was the kind of practical skill that medieval rulers appreciated, the ability to knock down walls and intimidate enemies with very large, very loud weapons. So Orbin travelled to Constantinople and presented himself to the emperor with what was essentially a medieval job application. "Your Majesty, I can build you cannons that will make your enemies weep and your walls impregnable." It should have been the beginning of a beautiful professional relationship. The Byzantine Empire desperately needed better military technology. Orbin needed employment, and everyone could have lived happily ever after, or at least until the next diplomatic crisis. Unfortunately, the Byzantine Empire in 1452 had approximately as much money as a university student 3 days before payday. The imperial treasury was running on fumes, prayers, and the occasional debasement of whatever coins they could find in the palace cushions. Constantine looked at Orbin's proposal and had to deliver the kind of rejection that summarizes the decline of a once great empire in a single sentence. "Your ideas are brilliant, your skills are exactly what we need, and we cannot afford you." Orbin, being a practical man who needed to eat and pay rent, decided to explore other employment opportunities in the neighborhood. The neighborhood, unfortunately for the Byzantine Empire, included Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Empire, who was preparing to attack Constantinople and who had both the resources and the motivation to invest heavily in siege warfare technology. Mehmed looked at Orbin's credentials and saw not just an engineer, but the solution to a strategic problem that had been troubling Ottoman military planners. Constantinople was protected by some of the strongest fortifications in the medieval world malls that had withstood sieges for over 1,000 years. What Mehmed needed was something that could punch through those ancient defences, and Orbin was offering exactly that. The Sultan gave Orbin everything he needed: unlimited resources, skilled assistance, the finest materials available, and most importantly, a deadline. "Build us a cannon," Mehmed said, "and make it the largest, most devastating piece of artillery the world has ever seen." Orbin, now properly funded and motivated, set to work with the enthusiasm of an engineer who finally has a patron who understands the value of really big explosions. In just 3 months, he completed what would become known as the Basilica, a cannon so massive that it required 60 oxen to move it, so powerful that its sound could be heard for miles, and so effective that it could reduce the walls of Constantinople to rubble. The psychological impact was almost as important as the physical destruction. Medieval warfare was largely about sieges, and sieges were largely about who got tired of waiting first. Defenders would wait for relief forces, attackers would wait for starvation or disease to do their work for them, and everyone would wait for someone to lose their nerve. But when you can knock down a section of wall with each shot, suddenly siege warfare becomes much more straightforward. When the Ottoman siege began, Orban's cannon played exactly the role Mehmed had envisioned. The ancient walls that had protected Constantinople since the time of Constantine the Great crumbled under bombardment from weapons they had never been designed to withstand. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 marks the end of the Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of Rome, an institution that had lasted for over 1,000 years. The ripple effects extended far beyond the immediate military victory. It shifted the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean, accelerated the Ottoman expansion into Europe, and symbolically marked the end of the medieval period. And it all happened because one emperor couldn't afford to hire the right engineer. The truly maddening aspect of this story is how easily it could have been different. If the Byzantine Empire had found the money sold some imperial jewelry, imposed a special tax, borrowed from Italian bankers, they could have hired Orban themselves. Instead of facing the most advanced siege artillery of the age, they could have been deploying it. Constantine XI died fighting on the walls of his capital, probably within range of the very cannon that might have been defending his city if imperial finances had been managed better. It's a perfect example of how great historical changes can hinge on the most mundane considerations. The fall of the Byzantine Empire wasn't caused by grand strategic miscalculations or inevitable historical forces. It was caused by a budget shortfall and one engineer's need to find steady employment. But speaking of employment decisions with far-reaching consequences, let's travel to North Korea, where a Disney-obsessed heir to a totalitarian regime was about to discover that some vacation destinations are worth more than they appear to cost. 9. The Disneyland trip that toppled a dynasty. The 21st century proved that even totalitarian regimes can be undone by theme park enthusiasm and fake passports. North Korea, 2001. The Hermit Kingdom was doing what it did best, maintaining the kind of paranoid secrecy that makes medieval fortress states look transparent by comparison. The Kim family had been running the country like a personal fiefdom for decades, complete with personality cults, nuclear ambitions, and a foreign policy that could generously be described as aggressively antisocial. Kim Jong-nam was the eldest son of Kim Jong-il, and the presumptive heir to this particular throne of madness. In the late 1990s, he held senior positions in the Ministry of Public Security and was working on developing North Korea's information technology systems, which probably involved figuring out how to have computers without accidentally letting people access the internet. Jong-nam seemed to be following the traditional path of North Korean succession: learn the family business, master the art of being simultaneously feared and adored, and prepare to inherit a country where questioning the leadership was roughly as healthy as juggling live grenades. But Jong-nam had developed what would prove to be a fatal character flaw for someone in his position. He had studied in Switzerland, travelled internationally, and developed a distinctly non-Hermit Kingdom perspective on life. While his father was maintaining North Korea's isolation with religious fervour, Jong-nam was quietly becoming the sort of person who might wonder why other countries seem to have things like reliable electricity and food in their grocery stores. And apparently he had developed an interest in Disney theme parks. Now, for most people, wanting to visit Disneyland is a perfectly reasonable recreational goal. For the heir to a regime that had spent decades teaching its citizens that the outside world was populated by evil capitalist monsters waiting to corrupt innocent North Korean souls, it was what intelligence analysts call problematic. Jongnam's solution to this problem was to acquire a fake passport and sneak into Japan to visit Tokyo Disneyland. Let that sink in for a moment. The future leader of one of the world's most paranoid, isolated regimes decided that seeing Mickey Mouse was worth risking an international incident. The plan might have worked if Jongnam had possessed even basic criminal competence. Unfortunately for him, fake passport fraud requires a certain attention to detail that he apparently lacked. Japanese authorities caught him at the airport, discovered his false Dominican Republic passport, and suddenly found themselves in possession of the North Korean crown prince during what was supposed to be a family vacation to the Magic Kingdom. The diplomatic embarrassment was immediate and spectacular. North Korea's carefully maintained image of discipline, loyalty, and ideological purity had been shattered by the revelation that the leader's own son was so desperate to experience capitalist entertainment that he was willing to commit passport fraud. Kim Jong-il, faced with the humiliating news that his heir apparent had been arrested trying to sneak into Disneyland, cancelled a planned state visit to China and began the process of quietly removing Jongnam from the succession. The irony was perfect. A regime built on the principle that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous had been undermined by their future leader's determination to prove that assumption wrong by visiting the most wholesome place on earth. Jongnam spent the next several years in exile, living primarily in China and Macau, giving occasional interviews to foreign journalists, and generally behaving like someone who had discovered that life outside North Korea was considerably more pleasant than life inside it. He lived openly and luxuriously, which for someone from the Kim family was roughly equivalent to taking out a full-page advertisement in the Washington Post titled, "Everything my government says about the West is wrong." Intelligence agencies believed he had connections to China and possibly even worked as a CIA informant, though this was never confirmed. What was certain was that he had become everything his father's regime claimed to oppose: a North Korean who preferred life in the capitalist world. When Kim Jong-un was chosen as the next leader in 2010, Jongnam represented the kind of problem that totalitarian regimes handle with characteristic subtlety. He knew too much, lived too openly, and had demonstrated that defection was not only possible but potentially quite pleasant. According to South Korean intelligence, Yong-gun issued a standing order to have his half-brother eliminated. Yong-gun survived several assassination attempts and even wrote a letter begging his brother to spare his life, which suggests he understood exactly how seriously the new leadership took family loyalty. On February 13th, 2017, Jongnam was assassinated at Kuala Lumpur Airport when two women approached him and smeared VX nerve agent on his face. The women claimed they thought they were participating in a prank for a television show, which would be touching if it weren't so obviously ridiculous. Most experts believe the assassination was ordered by Kim Jong-un, making it one of history's more elaborate responses to a theme park visit. Jongnam later said that the real reason he fell from grace wasn't the Disneyland incident itself, but his support for economic reforms and political openness, ideas he had developed during his time studying in Switzerland and living abroad. The tragedy of Jongnam's story isn't just personal nil, it's a perfect example of how authoritarian regimes destroy themselves through their own paranoia. Instead of learning from Jongnam's experiences or considering that his perspective might be valuable, the North Korean leadership saw his knowledge of the outside world as a threat to be eliminated. By killing the one family member who understood how the rest of the world actually worked, they ensured that North Korea would remain trapped in the kind of isolation that makes every decision a potential disaster and every policy a roll of the dice. But if you think family drama in totalitarian regimes is complicated, wait until we travel back to ancient Rome, where trusting the wrong person led to one of military history's most devastating betrayals. 10. The Roman general who trusted a German. Some mistakes are so spectacular they echo through millennia, reminding us that trusting the wrong person has been ending civilizations since people first figured out how to organize armies. Germania 9 AD. The Roman Empire was doing what it did best, conquering everything in sight with the methodical efficiency of a particularly aggressive bureaucracy. Rome had already swallowed most of the known world, turning diverse cultures into tax-paying provinces with impressive regularity. Publius Quintilius Varus was the man charged with turning Germania into Rome's next success story. He was a competent general, experienced administrator, and exactly the sort of person you'd trust to transform a collection of barbarian tribes into productive Roman citizens who paid their taxes on time and built nice straight roads. Varus had every reason to feel confident about his mission. Rome had been conquering Germanic tribes for generations. The local populations had shown interest in Roman trade and culture, and he had even managed to recruit Germanic nobles into the Roman army. One of these nobles was a young man named Arminius, who represented everything Rome hoped to achieve in Germania. He had been educated in Rome, served in the Roman military, spoke Latin fluently, and seemed to embody the successful integration of Germanic culture into the Roman system. Arminius was exactly the sort of ally that made Roman expansion possible, a local leader who could bridge the gap between Roman authority and Germanic traditions, helping to transform conquered territories into peaceful, productive provinces. Varus trusted Arminius completely, which in hindsight was roughly equivalent to trusting a fox to guard your henhouse while you went on vacation. What Varus didn't know was that Arminius had been conducting what can only be described as history's most successful undercover operation. While serving in the Roman army and earning Varus's confidence, he had been secretly working to unite the Germanic tribes against Roman rule. This was considerably more difficult than it sounds. Germanic tribes had been fighting each other for centuries, maintaining complex webs of alliances, rivalries and grudges that made modern European politics look straightforward by comparison. But Arminius had something powerful to offer: detailed knowledge of Roman military tactics, strategic planning, and most importantly, the complete trust of the Roman commander. In the summer of 9 AD, as Varus was leading his legions back to winter quarters, Arminius approached him with disturbing news. There was a small local rebellion that needed immediate attention. It was exactly the sort of minor uprising that Roman commanders dealt with regularly, a handful of troublemakers who needed to be reminded about the benefits of Roman citizenship, probably resolved with a show of force and some stern lectures about law and order. Varus trusted Arminius's intelligence completely. Why wouldn't he? The man was a Roman officer, had always provided reliable information, and understood both Roman interests and local conditions better than anyone. So Varus led his army of somewhere between 15 and 20,000 Roman soldiers into a dense, remote forest to deal with what he believed was a minor police action. The Teutoburg forest was exactly where you wouldn't want to fight a major battle if you were a Roman legion. Dense woods made it impossible to maintain formation. Rough terrain prevented cavalry from maneuvering effectively, and the Germans knew every tree, stream, and hiding place. Roman military success depended on organization, discipline, and the ability to fight as a coordinated unit. Germanic warfare relied on mobility, local knowledge, and the kind of guerrilla tactics that turned organized armies into confused mobs. As the Roman column stretched out through the forest, slowed by bad weather and difficult terrain, Arminius triggered his trap. Germanic warriors who had been positioned throughout the forest over several days launched a coordinated ambush that turned the Roman march into a massacre. The legions, strung out in a long column and unable to form their traditional battle formations, found themselves fighting multiple enemies in terrain that negated every tactical advantage they possessed. The battle lasted several days, with the Romans fighting desperately to maintain cohesion, while Germanic forces harassed them from positions that provided perfect cover and easy escape routes. By the end of the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, almost the entire Roman force had been wiped out. Varus committed suicide during the fighting, rather than face capture and the humiliation of defeat. The loss was so devastating that Rome abandoned its plans to conquer territory beyond the Rhine River. Emperor Augustus, upon hearing the news, was said to have wandered his palace crying, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." The numbers of the legions destroyed at Teutoburg were never used again. 17, 18, and 19 were permanently retired from the Roman military. a mark of respect for the dead and acknowledgement of the catastrophe. The long-term consequences were enormous. Many of the Germanic tribes that would later invade and weaken the Western Roman Empire came from the very region that Rome failed to control after Teutoburg. The battle effectively established the Rhine as the permanent boundary between Roman and Germanic territories, shaping the cultural and political development of Europe for centuries. But perhaps most significantly, Teutoburg demonstrated that Roman military supremacy had limits, and that those limits could be exposed by someone who understood Roman methods well enough to turn them against the empire. Arminius had accomplished something that no foreign king or rival empire had managed. He had inflicted a defeat so complete that Rome never fully recovered its confidence in Germanic expansion. The truly brilliant aspect of Arminius's plan was psychological as much as tactical. By earning Varus's complete trust, he hadn't just gained intelligence about Roman military planning, he had positioned himself to feed false information directly to the Roman command structure. Varus walked into the Teutoburg forest believing he was dealing with a minor rebellion that his trusted Germanic ally had discovered. Instead, he was leading his legions into a carefully prepared killing ground designed by that same ally. It was a masterpiece of deception that required years of preparation, perfect timing, and the kind of strategic patience that most people associate with chess grandmasters rather than barbarian chieftains. But if you think ancient betrayals were sophisticated, wait until we see how modern military planning can turn competence into catastrophe through nothing more than indecision and wishful thinking. 11. How Germany snacked defeat from victory. The Second World War proved that you can have the best defensive positions in the world and still manage to lose them through a combination of indecision, wishful thinking, and spectacularly bad timing. 1944, and the German High Command was facing what should have been a straightforward strategic question: where would the Allies invade continental Europe? This wasn't exactly a mystery wrapped in an enigma. The Allies needed to establish a foothold in Western Europe. They had limited options for where to land, and everyone involved knew that the invasion was coming sometime in the summer of 1944. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, displaying the kind of logical thinking that had made him one of Germany's most successful commanders, believed the invasion would come at Calais. This made perfect strategic sense. It was the shortest distance across the English Channel. It had excellent ports for supply operations, and it offered the most direct route into Germany. Erwin Rommel, who was in charge of coastal defences and had spent considerable time thinking about how to repel an amphibious invasion, also focused on Calais, but warned that the Allies could potentially land anywhere along the French coast, including Normandy. Both generals agreed that the key to defeating an Allied invasion was having enough mobile reserves, particularly tank divisions, positioned where they could respond quickly to wherever the landing actually occurred. This is where Adolf Hitler's leadership style turned what should have been competent military planning into a case study in how not to run a war. Hitler, demonstrating his characteristic inability to make clear decisions when it mattered most, chose to split the difference between his generals' recommendations. Some tank divisions were positioned near the coast to support Rommel's defensive strategy. Others were held back inland to serve as Rundstedt's mobile reserve. The result was that neither commander got what they needed. The coastal divisions weren't close enough to the beaches to stop an invasion in the first few hours, while the inland reserves weren't far enough back to serve as a proper strategic reserve for the entire front. It was military planning by committee, which works about as well as you'd expect when the committee includes someone whose strategic thinking had been notably questionable since around 1941. Meanwhile, the Allies were conducting one of history's most successful deception campaigns, Operation Fortitude, which was designed to convince the Germans that the real invasion would indeed come at Calais, with Normandy serving as a diversionary attack. The deception was so effective that even after Allied forces began landing in Normandy on June 6th, German commanders remained convinced it was just a feint to draw attention away from the real invasion that would surely come at Calais. This created the surreal situation where German forces were watching the largest amphibious invasion in history unfold in front of them, while their leadership insisted it was probably just a distraction. The comedy of errors continued with what can only be described as the worst possible timing for key German personnel to take leave. Rommel, the man most responsible for defending the Atlantic Wall, decided to visit his wife for her birthday on June 6th. Other senior officers were also away from their posts, attending a wargame exercise in Brittany. It was as if the entire German command structure had decided that the first week of June was an excellent time for a vacation. The weather forecast had predicted storms that would make amphibious landings difficult, which convinced many German commanders that an invasion was unlikely. Unfortunately for them, Allied meteorologists had identified a brief window of improved weather that German forecasters had missed. As Allied forces began landing on the Norman beaches, the German response was hampered by confusion, communication failures, and the kind of bureaucratic paralysis that occurs when nobody wants to wake up the Führer with bad news. Rundstedt requested permission to move the strategic tank reserves toward Normandy, but Hitler was asleep, and his staff didn't want to disturb him. By the time the decision was finally made, Allied air forces had already begun systematically destroying the transportation infrastructure that German reinforcements would need to reach the battle. The German command structure, which had been designed around Hitler's micromanagement style, proved completely incapable of responding quickly to a rapidly developing situation. Decisions that should have taken minutes required hours, and hours turned into precious time that allowed Allied forces to establish and expand their beachheads. Despite fierce resistance from German forces actually engaged in the fighting, the Allies managed to secure 5 beachheads and land over 150,000 troops on D-Day. When Rommel returned from his wife's birthday party and assessed the situation, he tried to explain to Hitler that Germany's Atlantic Wall defences were collapsing and that the invasion could not be stopped with the resources currently available. Hitler's response was to refuse to believe the reports and insist that the real invasion was still coming at Calais. On July 17th, Rommel was seriously injured when Allied aircraft attacked his staff car, removing from the German command structure the one general who had understood the true nature of the threat facing Germany's western defences. The failure to stop the D-Day landings opened a second front in Western Europe that Germany simply didn't have the resources to sustain, while also fighting the Soviet Union in the east. What makes this military disaster particularly frustrating from a German perspective is how many opportunities they had to respond effectively. Better coordination between commanders, clearer decision-making authority, proper positioning of reserves, or even just having key personnel at their posts during the invasion might have made the difference between success and failure. The Atlantic Wall itself was actually quite formidable: concrete bunkers, beach obstacles, artillery positions, and millions of mines created defensive positions that should have been nearly impossible to overcome. German soldiers fought with the kind of desperate courage that makes military historians respect their tactical competence, even while condemning their cause. But all the concrete and courage in the world couldn't overcome the fundamental problem. Nobody was in charge when it mattered most. The D-Day landings succeeded not because German defences were weak, but because German decision-making was paralysed. The defenders had the weapons, the positions, and the motivation to repel the invasion, but they lacked the command structure necessary to coordinate an effective response. It was a perfect example of how organisational dysfunction can turn military strength into strategic weakness, and how even the best prepared defences are useless if nobody can decide how to use them. But speaking of strategic disasters caused by poor decision-making, let's journey to 19th century Russia, where the Tsarist government was about to make a real estate transaction so spectacularly short-sighted that it would reshape the global balance of power. 12. The bargain sale that created a superpower. Russia was having what financial analysts would politely describe as a challenging fiscal period, which in imperial terms meant they were broke, desperate, and looking around the palace for anything valuable they could sell without completely destroying their reputation. The Crimean War had been an expensive lesson in why you shouldn't pick fights with multiple European powers simultaneously. The Russian treasury was emptier than a student's bank account after spring break, and Tsar Alexander II was facing the kind of budget crisis that makes finance ministers wake up in cold sweats. Meanwhile, sitting in the far northwestern corner of the Russian Empire, Alaska was costing money without generating much revenue. It was populated mainly by fur trappers, indigenous peoples, and the occasional explorer who had gotten very lost, and its primary economic activity seemed to be making Russian bureaucrats wonder why they bothered keeping track of it. The territory was expensive to govern, difficult to defend, and so far from the center of Russian power that most people in St. Petersburg probably couldn't find it on a map without several attempts, and possibly a compass. But Alaska's biggest problem, from a Russian strategic perspective, was its location. It sat right next to British-controlled Canada, and Britain was exactly the sort of neighbour that Russia preferred to avoid after the recent unpleasantness in Crimea. If another war broke out between Russia and Britain, Alaska would be essentially indefensible. Russian forces would have to travel thousands of miles across Siberia and then somehow transport armies across the Pacific to defend territory that was surrounded by British naval power. It would be like trying to protect your lunch money while it's sitting in your enemy's backyard. So when American Secretary of State William Seward expressed interest in purchasing Alaska, the Russian government saw an opportunity to solve several problems simultaneously, generate some desperately needed revenue, remove a strategic liability, and block British expansion in North America. The price was $7.2 million, which worked out to approximately 2 cents per acre. To put this in perspective, you could probably buy more expensive real estate in most shopping mall parking lots. American reactions to the purchase were mixed. Many Americans referred to it as Seward's folly, suggesting that the Secretary of State had spent $7 million on what was essentially a very large, very cold wasteland, populated mainly by seals and disappointment. Critics called it an icebox, a polar bear garden, and various other terms that basically translated to expensive frozen wasteland that will never be worth anything. The American press had a field day with the purchase, publishing cartoons showing Seward trying to figure out what to do with his giant ice cube, and generally treating the whole affair as an expensive practical joke. From Russia's perspective, the sale probably seemed like brilliant financial management. They had gotten rid of a territory that cost more to maintain than it generated in revenue, removed a potential military liability, and made $7 million in the process. The Americans, meanwhile, had acquired 586,000 square miles of territory, more than twice the size of Texas, that they had no immediate use for and no clear plan to develop. For several decades, it looked like the critics might be right. Alaska remained sparsely populated, economically marginal, and generally seemed like the kind of purchase that future generations would use as an example of poor decision-making. But then people started finding things in Alaska. Gold was discovered in the 1880s, triggering a gold rush that brought thousands of prospectors north, and suddenly made Alaska seem considerably more interesting to American investors. The discovery of oil in the 20th century transformed Alaska from an expensive curiosity into a strategic resource that would eventually generate billions of dollars in revenue. During World War II, Alaska's location proved crucial for defending North America and projecting American power across the Pacific. The territory that had seemed strategically worthless in 1867 became a vital military asset when global warfare made the Pacific Ocean America's front yard. Alaska achieved statehood in 1959, making it a full member of the American Union rather than just a territorial possession with an unfortunate climate. Today, Alaska produces oil worth far more than the original purchase price every few months, not to mention its strategic value for military bases, shipping routes, and natural resources that haven't even been fully catalogued yet. The Russian Empire, of course, no longer exists to regret this particular real estate transaction. But if it did, the current Russian government would probably have some strong opinions about selling territory to the United States for 2 cents an acre that now contains military bases, oil reserves, and strategic positions that overlook Russian territory. The Alaska purchase perfectly illustrates how short-term thinking can create long-term consequences that nobody anticipates. Russia solved an immediate financial and strategic problem while accidentally helping to create the conditions for American emergence as a global superpower. It's one of history's great examples of how the right purchase at the right time can reshape the balance of global power, even when everybody involved thinks they're just making a routine business transaction. But if you think selling Alaska was short-sighted, wait until we meet Alexander the Great, whose failure to write a will created chaos that lasted for decades and changed the entire course of ancient history. 13. The Conqueror Who Forgot to Plan Ahead. Ancient Macedonia proved that you can conquer the known world and still fail at basic estate planning. Alexander the Great died in 323 BC at the age of 32, which by ancient standards wasn't particularly young, but was definitely premature for someone who had just finished building the largest empire in human history, and apparently hadn't given any thought to what would happen next. He left behind an empire that stretched from Greece to India, encompassing dozens of cultures, languages, and peoples who had been unified mainly by their shared experience of being conquered by a particularly ambitious Macedonian with excellent military instincts and questionable long-term planning skills. What he didn't leave behind was a clear succession plan, which for someone who had spent the last 13 years systematically conquering everyone he met, was an oversight roughly equivalent to building a magnificent cathedral and forgetting to include a roof. Alexander's only direct heir was an unborn child. His wife was pregnant at the time of his death, which from a succession planning perspective is about as useful as a promissory note written in disappearing ink. His half-brother Philip Aridaeus was technically available, but he had serious mental disabilities that made him unsuitable for ruling anything more complex than a small household, let alone a multinational empire that required constant military attention and diplomatic finesse. This left Alexander's empire in the hands of his generals, known as the Diadochi, who had been perfectly willing to follow Alexander's leadership, but were considerably less enthusiastic about following each other. What followed was nearly 50 years of conflict that historians call the Wars of the Diadochi, though the Great Macedonian free-for-all might be more descriptive. These were men who had conquered lands from Greece to India working as a team, but when left to divide those conquests among themselves, they demonstrated all the cooperation and mutual trust of hungry wolves fighting over a particularly appetizing carcass. The result was a series of shifting alliances, betrayals, assassinations, and civil wars that make modern political campaigns look like friendly neighborhood disputes. Ptolemy grabbed Egypt and decided it was plenty big enough for his ambitions, thank you very much. Seleucus took control of the eastern territories, including what would become the Seleucid Empire. Antigonus tried to hold together the central portions of Alexander's conquests, while various other generals carved out smaller kingdoms from whatever territory they could defend. The violence was both personal and political. These weren't distant enemies fighting over abstract principles. These were former comrades who had shared years of campaigning, knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, and now viewed each other as obstacles to their individual ambitions. One by one, most members of Alexander's immediate family were murdered during these power struggles. His son Alexander IV, who briefly held the theoretical title of joint king with Philip Aridia, was killed while still a child. His mother Olympias was executed. The royal bloodline that had conquered the known world was systematically eliminated by the very people who had helped build that empire. By 281 BC, Alexander's empire had fragmented into several major kingdoms: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in the east, the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia, and various smaller Hellenistic kingdoms scattered across what had once been a unified territory. The long-term consequences were enormous. Alexander's dream of a unified empire connecting east and west died with him, replaced by centuries of rivalry between successor kingdoms that spent more energy fighting each other than developing their territories. The fragmentation created power vacuums that would eventually be filled by Rome, which was just beginning its own imperial expansion and found the divided Hellenistic kingdoms much easier to conquer than Alexander's unified empire would have been. The cultural consequences were equally significant. Instead of a single Hellenistic civilization spreading from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, The successor kingdoms developed distinct identities, languages, and political systems that reflected their local conditions and the ambitions of their rulers. The irony is that Alexander had demonstrated remarkable strategic thinking in every other aspect of his conquests. He understood logistics, diplomacy, cultural integration, and military innovation. He had successfully managed the complexities of ruling diverse populations across vast distances. But he failed completely to address the most predictable challenge facing any ruler: what happens when you die? It wasn't as if succession crises were unknown in the ancient world. Every royal family in history had faced the problem of transferring power from one generation to the next. Alexander had observed succession disputes in other kingdoms, had seen how they could destabilize entire civilizations, and should have understood the importance of clear, stable arrangements for his own empire. Instead, he apparently believed he would live forever, or at least long enough to produce several adult heirs who could compete for the throne in an orderly fashion. The failure to establish a clear succession process didn't just cause the wars of the Diadochi, it guaranteed them. Without legitimate authority to determine who should rule, every general with an army and ambitions had an equally valid claim to power. Alexander's oversight created a situation where the only way to resolve competing claims was through warfare, ensuring that his empire would be torn apart by the very people who had helped him build it. It's a perfect example of how tactical brilliance can coexist with strategic blindness, and how even the most successful leaders can create disasters through the simplest failures of planning. But speaking of failures of planning that changed the course of history, let's sail west to meet Christopher Columbus, whose mathematical incompetence accidentally led to the discovery of an entire continent. 14. The navigator who couldn't do math. From succession disasters to navigational miscalculations, because the late 15th century proved that sometimes being spectacularly wrong about basic facts can accidentally change the course of human history. Christopher Columbus was many things: a competent sailor, a persistent advocate for his ideas, a man with a kind of confidence that could convince monarchs to fund wildly improbable voyages. What he was not, unfortunately, was particularly good at mathematics or geography. By the 1490s, educated Europeans had a reasonably accurate understanding of Earth's size, thanks to the work of ancient scholars like Eratosthenes, who had calculated the planet's circumference with remarkable precision over 1,000 years earlier. Most contemporary scholars understood that sailing west from Europe to reach Asia would require a journey of staggering length, roughly 12,000 nautical miles of open ocean, which with 15th century technology meant months at sea without sight of land, resupply opportunities, or any guarantee that your navigation was accurate enough to find anything smaller than a continent. It was the kind of voyage that would have required provisions for several months, ships designed for extended ocean travel, and a crew willing to sail into the unknown for longer than most people had ever been away from land. Columbus rejected these calculations with the confidence of a man who had apparently never met a textbook he couldn't improve upon. He believed the Earth was roughly 25% smaller than it actually is, which would have been a significant error even if he had stopped there. But Columbus also believed that Asia extended much farther east than it does, effectively shrinking the Pacific Ocean to a fraction of its actual size. Based on these creative interpretations of geography, Columbus calculated that Japan could be reached by sailing west from Europe in just a few weeks, a pleasant ocean cruise rather than a potentially suicidal journey into the unknown. Most experts, displaying the kind of academic caution that had kept them alive and employed, disagreed with Columbus's math. They pointed out that his calculations seemed to ignore most of what was known about the size of the Earth and the geography of Asia. But Columbus had two advantages. He was absolutely convinced he was right, and he was asking people for money who weren't necessarily experts in mathematics or geography themselves. The Spanish crown, fresh from completing the Reconquista and looking for new sources of revenue to fund their increasingly expensive royal lifestyle, decided that Columbus's confidence was worth a modest investment. If he was right, Spain would gain direct access to the wealth of Asia without having to deal with the Ottoman Empire, Italian merchants, or any of the other middlemen who were currently profiting from the spice trade. If he was wrong, they would lose 3 ships and some crew members, which in the context of 15th century exploration was roughly equivalent to a rounding error in the royal budget. So off sailed Columbus, convinced he would reach Japan in a matter of weeks, leading a crew who presumably trusted his navigational skills more than his mathematical abilities. The voyage proceeded exactly as Columbus had predicted, right up until they encountered something that wasn't supposed to exist: the American continents. Columbus's reaction to finding large land masses where his calculations said there should be open ocean was to insist that he had reached the Indies, presumably because admitting that entire continents existed in the wrong place would have required him to acknowledge that his geography was slightly flawed. The irony is perfect. If Columbus had used the correct measurements for the Earth's size and Asia's actual geography, the voyage would have seemed impossibly long and dangerous. No European monarch would have funded an expedition that required months at sea with no guarantee of finding anything except more ocean. Columbus's mathematical incompetence made his proposal seem reasonable. The accidental discovery of the Americas unleashed consequences that nobody could have anticipated. Within decades, European diseases were devastating indigenous populations, Spanish conquistadors were systematically looting 2 continents, and the global balance of power was shifting toward European nations that could exploit these new territories. The discovery led to the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, cultures, and diseases between the old and new worlds that fundamentally changed both sides of the Atlantic. European colonization of the Americas would eventually lead to the establishment of colonies that became the United States, fundamentally altering the balance of global power and creating the conditions for European dominance that would define the next several centuries. Columbus died believing he had reached Asia, which suggests that mathematical errors once firmly established can be remarkably resistant to correction, even when faced with overwhelming evidence. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Columbus's story is that it demonstrates how the biggest discoveries in history sometimes happen for the worst reasons. His voyage succeeded not because his planning was excellent, but because his calculations were so wrong that they made an impossible journey seem reasonable. And all because an entire continent happened to be sitting exactly where Columbus's faulty mathematics said he should find a convenient shortcut to Japan. But if you think accidental discoveries can reshape civilizations, wait until we see how the Treaty of Versailles proved that victory in war doesn't guarantee wisdom in peace. 15. The peace treaty that guaranteed another war. 1919 proved that winning a world war doesn't automatically grant you the wisdom to write a peace treaty that won't cause the next one. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The symbolism was intentional. The Allies wanted to make it clear that Germany was paying for both the crime and the consequences. What they created instead was a document that combined the vindictiveness of a personal vendetta with the legal authority of international law, producing what can only be described as a masterclass in how to turn military victory into future catastrophe. The treaty forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the war, which in legal terms is called the War Guilt Clause, and in practical terms meant that Germany would be paying for the damage caused by a conflict that involved multiple nations, competing alliances, and a complex web of causes that couldn't reasonably be blamed on any single country. It was like holding one person responsible for a multi-car accident that involved faulty traffic signals, drunk drivers, and mechanical failures across several vehicles. Germany was also required to give up significant territory, including Alsace-Lorraine to France, parts of Prussia to Poland, and various other regions to neighbouring countries. These weren't just empty lands. They included some of Germany's most industrial and economically productive areas. The military restrictions were equally severe. Germany was limited to an army of 100,000 men, forbidden from having an air force, restricted to a tiny navy, and prohibited from manufacturing or importing weapons. The Rhineland was to be permanently demilitarized. But the most economically devastating aspect of the treaty was the reparations Germany was required to pay massive amounts of money to the Allied powers to compensate for war damage. The final reparations bill was set at 132 billion gold marks, which in today's money would be roughly equivalent to several $100 billion. To put this in perspective, it was more than Germany's entire gross domestic product, payable over decades. Many Germans felt these demands were not just excessive, but fundamentally unjust, especially since they had expected peace negotiations to follow President Wilson's 14 points, which had promised more reasonable and generous terms. Instead, they were presented with what amounted to a conditional surrender disguised as a peace treaty. The British economist John Maynard Keynes, who had been involved in the peace negotiations, warned that the treaty was economically impossible and politically disastrous. He called it a Carthaginian peace, referring to Rome's complete destruction of Carthage's designed to crush Germany rather than create stable peace. Keynes predicted that the harsh financial penalties would damage both Germany and the broader European economy, creating conditions for future conflict rather than preventing it. His warnings were largely ignored by political leaders who were more interested in satisfying their domestic audience's desire for revenge than in creating sustainable international relationships. The treaty created several million ethnic Germans who suddenly found themselves living outside Germany's new borders. The loss of territory combined with military restrictions and economic penalties fueled a sense of national humiliation that would prove politically useful for extremist movements. During the economic chaos of the Great Depression, when Germany was struggling to meet its reparations payments while dealing with massive unemployment and social upheaval, the treaty became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the post-war international system. Adolf Hitler built his political career largely on promises to overturn the Treaty of Versailles, restore German territory and military power, and make the countries that had imposed these terms pay for their betrayal of the German people. The Nazi rise to power was not inevitable. It required specific economic conditions, political miscalculations, and social circumstances that aligned in exactly the wrong way. But the Treaty of Versailles provided both the grievances and the popular support that extremist politics needed to flourish. When Hitler began his aggressive expansion in the 1930s, he consistently framed his actions as correcting the injustices imposed by Versailles. The remilitarization of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, the demands for Sudeten territory. The tragedy is that the Treaty of Versailles accomplished exactly the opposite of what its creators intended. Instead of ensuring that Germany would never again threaten European peace, it created conditions that made future conflict more likely. Instead of integrating Germany into a stable international system, it isolated and humiliated the German nation in ways that made cooperation with former enemies politically impossible. The Allies had won the military war but lost the peace, creating a settlement that satisfied nobody and solved nothing. By the time World War II began in 1939, most of the key provisions of the Treaty of Versailles had already been violated or abandoned, demonstrating that treaties built on punishment rather than reconciliation tend to be worth less than the paper they're written on. But if you think political leaders making bad decisions is a modern phenomenon, wait until we travel to France in the 1930s, where military planners were about to demonstrate that the best defences in the world are useless if you build them in the wrong place. 16. The wall that pointed in the wrong direction. French military planning in the 1930s proved that you can build the most sophisticated fortifications in the world and still manage to miss the point entirely. The Maginot Line was the product of excellent engineering, careful planning and strategic thinking that was approximately 20 years out of date before construction even began. After World War I, France was understandably concerned about the possibility of future German invasions. They had been invaded in 1870, 1814, and most recently 1914, which created the sort of pattern that makes military planners extremely nervous about eastern borders. The French military's solution was to build a defensive system so formidable that any future German attack would break against it like waves against a cliff. The Maginot Line would be a wall of steel and concrete that would make invasion impossible, or at least so costly that no rational enemy would attempt it. The fortifications were genuinely impressive. Underground bunkers connected by tunnels, artillery positions with overlapping fields of fire, obstacles designed to channel attacking forces into killing zones, and enough ammunition and supplies to withstand extended sieges. It was built in the 1930s, partly in response to Germany's growing strength under Hitler, and partly because France could not count on reliable help from Britain or the United States if another war began. France also had fewer young men available for military service than Germany, thanks to the demographic disaster of the First World War, so a defensive strategy made sense from a personnel perspective. The line ran from Switzerland to Luxembourg, creating what the French believed was an impenetrable barrier along their eastern border. But here's where French strategic thinking demonstrated the kind of gap that makes military historians weep. The Maginot Line didn't adequately protect the Ardennes forest or the border with Belgium. The reasoning was that the Ardennes was too difficult for a major army to cross. The terrain was rough, the roads were poor, and moving large numbers of troops and equipment through dense forest would be slow, dangerous, and easily detected. This assessment was technically correct, if you defined impossible as slightly more difficult than driving through a parking lot. The French had also assumed that any German attack would respect Belgian neutrality, or at least that Belgium would resist German invasion long enough for French forces to deploy and establish defensive positions. In May 1940, Germany demonstrated the flaws in these assumptions with characteristic thoroughness. Instead of attacking the Maginot Line directly, German forces went around it through Belgium and the Ardennes, using exactly the route that French planners had dismissed as impractical. The German advance through the Ardennes was not easy. It required careful planning, specialized equipment, and considerable risk, but it was entirely possible for a military force that was willing to accept some difficulties in exchange for strategic surprise. German armoured divisions moved through the forest roads faster than French intelligence had believed possible. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical advantage. The Maginot Line was supposed to be France's guarantee of security, proof that they had learned the lessons of the previous war and would never again be caught unprepared. Instead, it became a symbol of military thinking that was focused on the last war rather than the next one. The parts of the Maginot Line that were actually attacked performed reasonably well. The fortifications held firm and inflicted casualties on German forces, but by the time those attacks occurred, German armies were already behind the line, making the fortifications strategically irrelevant. It was like building an excellent door lock while leaving all the windows open. The fall of France in 1940 took just 6 weeks, despite the fact that France had spent enormous resources on defensive preparations and had military forces that were, on paper, roughly equivalent to Germany's. The Maginot Line had given French political and military leaders a false sense of security, encouraging them to believe that defensive preparations were sufficient while neglecting the mobile forces and flexible tactics that might have responded effectively to German innovation. After the war, historians debated whether the Maginot Line was a fundamentally flawed concept or simply incomplete. Some argued that extending the fortifications along the entire French border, including Belgium, might have forced Germany to attack the fortifications directly. Others pointed out that fixed fortifications were becoming obsolete in an era of mechanized warfare, close air support, and military tactics that emphasized speed and mobility over static positions. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Maginot Line was psychological rather than tactical. Defensive thinking tends to become defensive mindset, and defensive mindset tends to become passive response to enemy initiative. The French had built fortifications to avoid the casualties and devastation of another war like 1914 to 1918. Instead, they created conditions that made defeat more likely and more complete when war actually came. But speaking of military planning that achieved the opposite of its intended results, let's examine Operation Barbarossa, where Nazi Germany decided that the best way to win a war was to start fighting an entirely new enemy. 17. The invasion that destroyed an empire. Nazi Germany decided that the best way to consolidate their European conquests was to immediately start the largest and most destructive military campaign in human history. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, was Adolf Hitler's attempt to prove that German military planning had evolved beyond competence into something approaching megalomania with maps. The plan was breathtakingly simple: invade the Soviet Union with the largest military force ever assembled, defeat the Red Army in a few weeks, capture Moscow before winter arrived, and add the entire Soviet Union to the growing list of countries that had been improved by German occupation. It was the kind of strategy that looks brilliant on paper, assuming you use very small paper and ignore most of what history teaches about invading Russia. Initially, everything went exactly according to plan, which should have been the first warning sign that something was about to go spectacularly wrong. German forces achieved complete tactical surprise, surrounded and captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops in massive encirclements, and advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory in the first few weeks. Cities like Kiev fell after battles that saw entire Soviet army groups destroyed or captured. The German advance was so rapid and successful that it seemed to confirm Hitler's belief that the Soviet Union was, in his words, a rotten structure that would collapse at the first hard push. By late 1941, German forces were approaching Leningrad, Moscow, and other key Soviet cities. The campaign seemed to be proceeding ahead of schedule, and German military planners were already discussing what to do with all the territory they would soon control. But then several factors began to interfere with German planning, starting with the inconvenient fact that the Soviet Union was considerably larger than most countries Germany had previously conquered. The supply lines stretching back to Germany became longer and more vulnerable as German forces advanced deeper into Soviet territory. Equipment broke down, fuel became scarce, and ammunition supplies struggled to keep pace with the advancing armies. Russian weather, displaying its traditional hostility toward invading armies, began to turn cold earlier than German meteorologists had predicted. More importantly, Soviet resistance proved to be considerably more determined and effective than German intelligence had suggested. Instead of collapsing after the first few defeats, Soviet forces regrouped, counterattacked, and generally behaved like people defending their homeland rather than welcoming liberation by German efficiency experts. The siege of Leningrad became a nightmare that lasted nearly 900 days and killed over 1 million civilians, mostly from starvation. It was supposed to be a quick capture that would eliminate a major Soviet city and free German forces for other operations. Near Moscow, German forces got close enough to see the spires of the Kremlin through binoculars, but were then hit by a Soviet counterattack, supported by Siberian troops who were apparently unimpressed by German invincibility. By the end of 1941, Germany had lost over 800,000 soldiers' casualties that would have been catastrophic for most countries, and were certainly unprecedented for the German military. The failure of Barbarossa had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military disaster. Hitler, convinced that his generals were insufficiently committed to victory, began taking direct control of military operations, which generally made strategic planning even worse than it had been previously. As the war on the Eastern Front turned into a grinding battle of attrition, the Soviet Union began pushing westward, retaking territory, and eventually advancing into Eastern Europe. What had started as a German plan to defeat the Soviet Union ended up creating the conditions for Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, the Cold War, and the division of Germany itself. More people died on the Eastern Front than in all other theatres of World War II combined. The human cost was staggering: military casualties in the millions, civilian deaths from warfare, occupation, and starvation that defied comprehension. The Eastern Front became a war of extermination that consumed both nations and created the kind of destruction that made the First World War look like a minor disagreement. The truly tragic irony is that Germany already controlled most of continental Europe when Barbarossa began. They had defeated France, occupied most of Western Europe, and established what could have been a sustainable empire if they had focused on consolidation rather than expansion. Instead, they chose to attack the one remaining great power that had both the resources and the motivation to resist German domination indefinitely. By opening a second front against the Soviet Union while still fighting Britain and its allies, Germany guaranteed that they would be fighting a multi-front war with enemies who collectively had more resources, more manpower, and more strategic depth than Germany could possibly match. It was a strategic miscalculation so fundamental that it makes you wonder if German military planners had confused world conquest with a particularly challenging board game.